These mandarins were sizing up and it was going so well, but recently I arrived to find my citrus tree broke in half. I knew this young specimen wasn't ready to bear fruit, and after letting nature take its course, I've learned a valuable lesson. It takes time for their branches to mature before they can hold weight reliably. The priority for young citrus trees should be root development and establishing a balanced structure. Pruning consistently over the first few growing seasons and making some sacrifices will pay off in the long run. So in this video, I'll cover what you need to know in the event of such a structural catastrophe and how to prune your citrus trees. I'll be sharing several unique examples and take you through the process step by step. I'm Scott from New Garden Road, always out here to inform, inspire, and elevate you. Encouraging biodiversity and restoring habitat is my mission, one garden at a time. So why did this tree break in half? Ultimately because the limbs were too thin and they weren't ready for this moment. Larger fruiting varieties such as the sumo mandarin or grapefruits pose the greatest risk for this occurring. As those fruit begin to grow and get bigger, your tree may start to lean to one side, and a break could be the result of something as simple as a wind gust or a bird landing on it. To avoid this, we can prune for shape and structure over the course of the first few growing seasons, and our goal should be to establish a shrub-like structure. And when I say growing season, what I mean is the time of year when your trees are actively growing. For me in my Central Texas garden, that can begin as early as late February and can continue as long as growing conditions are ideal, many times into the month of November. It's important to use a pair of sharp, well-maintained pruning shears or even better, bypass pruners to do the job. Pruning shears are great for getting into tight spots, but they're only really suitable for pruning out smaller branches. When you pick out a pair of bypass pruners, generally they'll come with a cutting capacity such as 1/2 to 1 inch. The Felco number 8s that I've been using for years are rated for cutting up to 1 inch in diameter. In terms of examples, this sumo mandarin is a classic. It's got a really young central leader, and as those fruits started to grow and develop, which can often be pretty large, it simply snapped in half. All I'm going to do is prune out these broken branches and probably just let it go from there, let it regrow, see what happens. I don't think this is entirely a bad thing because I've only had this tree for about a year. It's not very tall, it hasn't done much, so there is a lot of opportunity for me to sculpt it going forward. A contrast to that would be this yuzu mandarin. This one is also about a year old, but you can see it's got a pretty tall upright structure, nice central leader, but it's growing and sprawling out to the side. So what I could see happening is something similar. If it starts to set fruit on the ends of those sprawling branches out to the side, they could easily break. So what I want to do is make sure that none of those are taller than the central leader on this tree. And over time, I do hope that I'll get more side branching lower on the tree. This can benefit your citrus tree long term by protecting the bark and the fruit from extremes in terms of sun exposure, because both the bark, the leaves, and the fruit can burn. Here in Central Texas, that begins to happen in late July into August. So that's why a shrub-like growth habit is important. The importance of having sturdy branching can be pretty easy to understand, but root development is another key ingredient in this process. Many of the young citrus trees that you'll be purchasing won't have a really well-developed root system, and it makes them more predisposed to leaning should they set up some fruit. I prune my citrus trees as needed throughout the course of the growing season, and while this is primarily focused on my younger trees, I'm doing this on my established trees as well, because from time to time they may have a dead branch or something just could go a little bit awry, and I don't want to have that in place. What I'm looking for is crossing of branches across the internal structure of the tree. It could be clustering at the end of a branch, which couldn't support the weight of multiple fruit, or acute angles, which could result in a split should it get a lot of fruit set. I will also prune out branches that are pointing downward in a significant fashion, because if they get some fruit to set up on there, they may end up touching the ground, and that's not good because ground-dwelling insects may take advantage, or they may start to rot from contact with the soil. So I've got some details I'd like to point out about bypass pruners. When you unlock these and open them up, you can see it's got a pretty flat blade, and it's only one blade. This crossbar here is what helps it to make that cut. And this blade side here should be on the side that you're making your cut. So if you've got your tree trunk here and there's a branch coming off to the side, you want to have this on the side of the trunk of the tree, because if you have this bar on that side, then you're going to get more of a gap. You won't be making the precise cut that you want to, and that's what's good about these. You can get a really precise, clean cut with them. They don't always get into tight spaces really well, Sometimes that can be difficult, but these have a greater cutting capacity than the pruning shear. So up to 1 inch, I can safely and easily make a good cut. Along with that, I like to keep them sharp. I'll do that with this Corona sharpening tool. It takes a little practice, but you can use this ahead of any pruning, and it helps to maintain your tool, keep it nice and sharp. Your cuts will be cleaner and more precise, so that's a good thing. In addition to that, I've got this spray lubricant here. It's just a little pump spray. This is a biodegradable one from Felco that I really like. This helps to prevent excess buildup of plant residue on your tools, and it keeps them working and functioning better. Helps to prevent rust, and also if you get like an annoying squeak or something in there, this is going to take care of it. This is a really weathered carrying pouch, and there are all kind of options out there, but something like this can be really handy because if you're doing a lot of pruning, in between having a place to put your tool besides a bucket or your pocket can be really handy. And I think it also helps you keep track of them. So keep them on your person, know exactly where they are. I think that's a good tip. When it comes to these pruning shears, you can see they're nice and pointed. That makes them easy to get into those tight spots, but they just don't cut branches as thick as a bypass pruner will do. So I think it's good to have both. You can build up to that over time. These have 2 blades. They're cutting just like scissors, essentially. This Kishu mandarin is a different story altogether. It's been growing for a few years, and I let it set some fruit this season, but what you'll see is the central leader has died. And I know that from looking at it, but what I want to show you is how you can tell. We're going to employ the scratch test. We're going to use either our fingernail or a pair of pruning shears and lightly scratch into the surface of that branch and make our way from the top down until we find a point where it's green. Because if it's brown, the branch is dead. If it's green, it's got some active growth. And at this point, you want to prune about 2 inches below that first indication of green, and that will be a great point for your tree to restart. In all cases, it's essential to follow up with regular and consistent fertilization because as you're taking away top growth, you want to encourage new top growth, and we do that by feeding our trees. I use both a concentrated liquid fertilizer that I will drench my citrus trees with, and I'll do that on a weekly basis throughout the growing season. And about every 4 to 6 weeks, I will also apply an organic granular slow release fertilizer, and I'll apply that directly to the soil underneath the mulch that I have in my containers. So I actively remove the pine straw that I have there, and I'll lightly massage that fertilizer in. I don't want to disrupt the roots in this. I just want to kind of get it to start mixing in just a little bit. While I do think you can get away with doing one or the other, it is my recommendation to do both, but whatever you choose to do, do it regularly and consistently. Historically, I've really enjoyed making my own concoction of liquid fertilizers for my citrus trees, and I would use things like this right here, the holy mackerel. That's a good source of nitrogen, some iron. I also have some cow mag, and this organic rev, which I do have an affiliate link for. This is a great source of microbes for that soil in your container, as well as humic and fulvic acid. But if I run out of one of those ingredients, or if I want to take a shortcut, I can use something that's more of an all-in-one application, like this MicroLife Ocean Harvest. This has got a great source of nutrients for your citrus trees, and all you have to do is put about 2 ounces per gallon in a measuring cup, mix that up with a gallon of water, and you're ready to apply it. One of the main things to consider when you're choosing a liquid fertilizer is the NPK ratio. In general, you'll find these 3 numbers on all fertilizer products, and you want the first number, which represents nitrogen and conveys to top growth, okay, so leaves and branching, you want that number to be higher. For example, this holy mackerel is a 310, so that's definitely headed in the right direction. And with this MicroLife, we can see that it's a 423, so that's a great option. An example to contrast would be this Neptune's Harvest fish fertilizer. I love this stuff, and it would go a long way to supporting growth of your citrus tree, but you can see it's a 241. That's got more phosphorus, which generally supports roots, fruits, and flowers. And I know you might be thinking, okay, well, citrus fruit is what we want. Why don't we give it that one? But I think it's the focus on evergreen leaf structures and that thick rind, which is associated with many citrus varieties, in addition to the long period of maturity. You're going to take 6 to 9 months of active growth, so they really need those building blocks of nitrogen to support them as they get developed. For my granular fertilizer, I really like the down-to-earth citrus mix. I've often used the Sustain brand 824. That's got a lot of nitrogen in it, which is perfect for these citrus trees. But the citrus mix has some other trace minerals which are really beneficial to our trees as they grow and develop. Now, how much you need can vary. I've got a whole video on how I like to make my custom blend for liquids, and I'll drop a link in that for you. But if you're looking at something like the MicroLife Ocean Harvest, what I've been doing in my application is I have a small watering can that's about 1.5 quarts. I'll mix my solution to proportion in a 2-gallon watering can and then redistribute part of that to the smaller watering can. And then I have a measured dose that I can give each one of my trees. And you really have to monitor for results. I think it's important to give them enough over not too little, but exactly how much liquid drench you need to give your container grown citrus tree will vary based on the amount of soil, the size of the pot. So I think it's good to just start with something and see how it goes. And I do think that applying it on a regular basis will give you the most benefit long term. When applying a granular fertilizer, you'll likely find an application rate on the back of the package, but I found this not to be quite as helpful with my container grown citrus trees, because if it's based on the circumference of the base of the tree, then I think it could be too much in some cases. Most of my trees are either growing in 16 to 18 inch terracotta pots, so I wouldn't want to put more than, say, 2 cups of fertilizer in there during an application. But again, I'm giving this to them several times over the course of the growing season, and I gotta tell you, this citrus mix for me makes the biggest impact. I think the liquid drench is a good companion to this process, and in that way you're doing as much as you can. I don't think you're overdoing it, but this granular fertilizer really packs a punch. I think when you're growing in containers, you're oftentimes washing out nutrients, as well as that tree is eating the organic matter over time, so you're getting a little bit of sinking in that pot. So adding back in organic matter in the form of these granular fertilizers is really beneficial. I have one citrus tree planted in ground, and it's a good contrast to my container grown specimens, because with this one you can follow the application rate on the back of your granular fertilizer to a T. You want to evenly distribute that fertilizer underneath the canopy of the tree, which is essentially, if you look at the tree's profile where those branches come out to and you come straight down, underneath that entire area is where you want to apply that fertilizer. And for me, I went with about 4 to 6 cups. There is a really large circumference on my bloom sweet grapefruit tree, but I did what I could manage or afford in this case, and I did see good results. Pruning during the growing season does come with some obstacles, and the first one is most obvious. That is fruit that have set up on your tree already. My trees like to bloom in January and February, and sometimes they hold over fruit that they have set in the fall. This makes it a little bit more difficult to approach them. You have to be very careful. Inevitably, each season I will get in there to do some work and inadvertently cut off one of those fruit. But that's how it goes. Sometimes you got to do what you need to do. The other option is to prune after you harvest, and that could be going into the cooler season, which we do need to be careful with, because we don't necessarily want to stimulate new growth when we get into the range of a freeze, because that tender young foliage would be more susceptible to freeze damage. You always need to protect your citrus trees from sub-freezing temperatures, but that's just something to take into consideration. Still, if it's me and if I need to prune my tree and I've been waiting for the fruit to come to harvest before I do so, then I'll go ahead and take a shot at it, get it done. Because especially when we're talking about young trees early in their development, it's important that you shape them during that time. The other obstacle may be less obvious to you, but in my growing region here in Austin, Texas, we have the giant swallowtail butterfly, which will host on citrus trees. This is a beautiful butterfly, and I have them throughout the season. Multiple generations will host on my citrus. You will see little nibbles on the leaves, and you might think, okay, what's going on? This is not good. Something's eating my tree. Well, yes, something is eating your tree, and it is good because it's beautiful and it's not going to hurt your tree. So the thing to remember is, as you prune, you need to keep your eye out for those young caterpillars. They look like bird poop. I know, it's exciting, but do what you need to do. You could always encourage them to go on to another leaf, but just something to be aware of as you make your way through this process, because for me, I'm always a little bit worried that I'm going to mess up nature in the process of things. But regardless, it's important to take action, and when we do, we'll be cultivating the healthiest citrus trees that we can, and this will also provide for nature in addition to us. Right now I'm watching one of the green anoles that are throughout my garden space, and I've been seeing frequently on my citrus trees. It's climbing up one of the bamboo poles for this shade structure. The ones that I've been noticing on my trees are just babies. I don't know what you call baby lizards other than baby lizards, but maybe you call them something else. Still, the ones that I'm seeing, literally like 1 inch. I mean, super tiny. And I may be there about to prune and I'm going to cut and I see the lizard, or maybe I see the swallowtail butterfly caterpillar, and I just kind of freeze. Not something to be scared about or overly worried about, but be aware of and keep on growing. Citrus trees purchased from a nursery are likely grafted onto a rootstock. Essentially, what this means is a fruiting portion of the tree, such as a grapefruit, has been fused onto some rootstock that is not intended to produce fruit for you, but this can give it some cold tolerance or adaptability to your soil types. But what will happen, especially early on as that tree is developing and is getting some roots set up, you'll get some sprouts coming from the rootstock. And you don't usually want these to grow because they're going to be taking energy and the fertilizer that you're applying to this tree and going in an entirely different direction. What I think is unique to point out is in most cases, the foliage will look different than the tree that you want to grow for fruit. All of my specimens are growing on flying dragon rootstock, so it's got a pretty clear trifoliate pattern. They're thorny, and the fruiting scion have a different leaf pattern altogether. Some of them are thorny, but not all of them. So for me, I have a trained eye and I can distinguish between the two. And this is important because sometimes you can't tell exactly where the graft point is on your tree. Over the last year, I've learned of one example when allowing the rootstock can be beneficial. In the case of my Bloom Sweet grapefruit tree, which has been severely damaged over the course of several winters, I've seen some dieback on the south-facing portion of that rootstock. And what I learned from one of my friends, shout out to Figbeard, is that if you allow that rootstock to grow a little bit, maybe prune it, over the course of a couple of years, you will be infusing new growth or healing capacity into that area. And that's exactly what I've seen in my citrus tree. I did learn about this example through one of my container grown fig trees. I've got a video on those. If you want to check it out, I'll drop a link in the description. Another thing that I want to point out to you is that when you buy your citrus tree, you may see that it has some type of stake in the pot. Most of mine come with a galvanized metal stake, and it's got some red tape that's going above and below that graft point. And that's what it's there for, to support it as it takes hold, grows, and gets stronger. Now, this can take 6 months or more, but you can and should remove that stake. I didn't always do this early on in my citrus growing journey, but what I've learned is they can get stuck. The roots will grow around them, and later on, if you go to remove them, you'll have a hard time doing it. This might not be the worst thing in the world, but it can be a cosmetic nuisance, and since these trees can be so long-lived, you're going to be stuck with it. There is a scenario, and I have a couple of examples for you for when I would reintroduce a stake to support one of my citrus trees. If they start to set up some heavy fruit and get a little bit of a lean on them, that would run counterproductive to all the pruning and shaping that I've been enacting over the years, because if you just let them be like that, they may continue to grow like that. The important thing to note is that once I harvest those fruit, I will remove that stake. Structural root pruning could be an option long term when growing in a container, because unless you pot them up or put them into a larger pot with more soil every few years as needed, then you're going to want to maintain that root zone. And this requires that you actually take the tree out of the pot and cut away some of those roots. In addition, you would cut some of the top portion of the tree, essentially kind of shrinking it. This is an approach that would be utilized in the practice of bonsai, but here I'm just trying to keep my citrus in a smaller container. I've been to the botanical garden in San Antonio, and they've got some really beautiful citrus tree specimens in one of their courtyards, but I can tell you they need a forklift to move these things around. So what I'm going for is something smaller that I can utilize a hand truck or dolly to move around as needed. Oh snap, my citrus tree broke in half. What do I do? When you pick out a pair of, so you do want my Kishu mint. So likely because over the last year I've got some nice, now check out more awesome gardening videos on my channel, like this video, and follow New Garden Road for weekly content. You can grow your own citrus trees. Keep it organic.